friends. I'm not going to allow for a long intro today because I'm pretty lit, pretty excited. Today is a day that will live in glorious fame, June 24th, 2022. Roe v. Wade has been overturned as a constitutional right, and it will be returned to the states for them to determine what to do. So this is a great day. Question I've been working through, and I've been working on this, thinking about it for a few days, is as I've been discussing bias, is God biased? And so there's going to be really four things that we're going to want to take note of in terms of God's, what are called great-making property. And I'm speaking about the traditional God of Judeo-Christianity here. And specifically, that's a maximally great being, a being that otherwise cannot be, a greater being cannot be imagined than that being. And if you're not familiar with the ontological argument, that's great. Maybe we'll come back to that at some point. But that's essentially the argument for the ontological argument, is that God is nothing greater than God can be imagined, and hence he must be. And you're working through the logic of that. That's a whole other discussion. So we're interested in God's omnipotence. So that is his all-powerfulness. So that's number one, great-making property. Number two, omnipresence, which means that God is everywhere. He has the capacity to be everywhere at the same time. And if you were to push me further, I'd say he's everywhere and sometimes nowhere. And of course, we could qualify that. But for this conversation, omnipresence, he's everywhere. Omniscience, which means that he knows everything. And then lastly, immensity, the great-making property of immensity. Now, this is the one we're really going to focus down on as we have this discussion. Is God biased? And immensity says that God can attend to all data points at all times, in all places, without diminution to his attention capabilities, and therefore without sequence. So being able to compute and see all data at all times in all places, or think through that, there isn't any really like thinking through it with God as a maximally great being. It would be that he could be attentive to everything at the same time without any need to diminish his attention on one while thinking through the other. And this is really remarkable. I mean, it's the stuff, only something supremely divine, maximally awesome, could we even begin to have a discussion about. And so I think the question then, and for the rest of this conversation, the nuance I came up with to try to solve this is that I think that God, so I think there's a difference between a point of view and bias for this conversation. Many people could use the phrase point of view as being synonymous with bias, and that's perfectly fine. I mean, that's perfectly fine. Now, for this conversation, I'm going to distinguish the two to try to give us a way to think about these things. But bias is born out of limitation. And so limitation is something that an eternal, infinite being, such as God, traditionally understood, it's not something that he is defined by. Matter of fact, it would be the fact that God breaks all totalitarities. So anything that could circumscribe him or say cage him in, if you want to think about it in a little bit easier way, anything that would put boundaries on him would be something that would be fundamentally opposed to the fact that Scripture is going to talk about God as being eternal and that his kingdom is everlasting. And so you have a lot of the scriptural language that is suggestive of infinity. And infinity itself has this notion of, it's actually a negative attribute. It means that, that which is finite. So we understand everything we know is this kind of positive thing of having limitations on it. So infinity is saying that that positive limitation, I mean, it's just definitional to our experience. Like everything has limitations. And then you talk about God. So somebody without limitation. Very hard to wrap the human mind around. Bias then is always born out of limitations. And therefore, all biases are points of view because it's going to limit your view on things. Your limitations, i.e. your biases, are going to limit your view on things, and hence you're going to have a point of view. Now, importantly, because I think that I've listened to enough psychoanalysts to know that this could be an objection, the notion that you can't eliminate certain biases, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that you can't eliminate having a point of view, and as such, that's going to represent bias. So the question would then become, what are good biases and what are bad biases for basically directing and constituting my point of view? that you could eliminate a bad bias that you think is unhealthy and bad is entirely possible. So it's not possible to eliminate certain biases. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that thinking that you can escape bias altogether is to think that you can escape being human. Because humans are defined by restrictions, and as such, their point of view is born out of those restrictions and those biases. All right, so biases are not the same, though, as point of view. All biases are going to have a point of view. So all biases are points of views, but not all points of views, when we think about God, are biased. Okay, so what's the distinction? Dr. Scalise, tell us. The distinction is this. Humanity's point of view is born out of their limitation, their limited point of view on things, because they're creatures. We're limited by definition. That is what we are. And hence our biases are always going to frame the way we think about things. Impossible that it could be otherwise, in my humble opinion. God, on the other hand, though, has a point of view, a profound point of view if you read the Bible, right? There's a huge amount of historical events in Scripture. One that we argue about a lot is the resurrection of Jesus Christ, right? If you go out there and listen to Bart Ehrman, he's going to say, well, my hypothesis is that the disciples stole the body and Jesus is a mass grave somewhere and no one knows about it, right? And that would be his way to try to explain that the bodily disappearance of Jesus Christ, the fact that nobody has ever been able to produce the body. Now, there's a lot of difficulties with that, right? The Roman soldiers were there to guard it. The notion that the apostles basically became Navy SEALs and overcame a slew of Roman guards, and there's a lot of difficulties. But my point is that Bart Ehrman's theory could be considered viable, and opposed to the Gospels, the four Gospels. Their point of view on things. Their point of view on things is that Jesus Christ resurrected, he went and taught, and then he went off to heaven, and then you have this radical, incredible, crazy conversion of Paul and Jesus' brother. It's kind of crazy, right? Jesus' own brother, his half-brother, but Jesus' own brother is like, oh, my brother's God, and goes out there and starts preaching that. Paul, he's murdering Christians. All of a sudden, he's for Christians. You got a lot of really difficult data to deal with there if it's just like, oh, the apostles are a bunch of criminals. I mean, right, that's what they are. Glorified criminals, stole the body, mass buried, and put it in a buried grave somewhere and didn't tell anyone. Then they went out and risked their lives for something that they adamantly knew was false. That's a very difficult thing to sell, in my opinion. It doesn't sound very convincing. It doesn't really explain the data very well. But neither here nor there. But Bart Ehrman's mass grave theory, right? Jesus got thrown into the mass grave by the disciples after they overcame the Romans, blah, blah. Okay, so that theory is a point of view that's profoundly different from the Gospel's point of view. The Gospel's point of view, historically speaking, is that it would be God's point of view. God delivered the scriptures, and I can go through theories of inspiration and writing of the New and Old Testament. I'm totally capable of doing that, and maybe I'll do it another time. But for this conversation, God's point of view on the matter is that Jesus resurrected and that he needs to be understood as the Son of God in this potently powerful sort of way that the resurrection is coming to pass, and it means the recreation of all creation. And you have this end time situation where the future resurrection of all things and their recreation gets embodied and distilled down to the singular event of the resurrection. All right, so that's God's view on it versus Bart Ehrman's view, right? So God has a profoundly strong bent on the way the resurrection of Jesus Christ should be understood. Okay, the New Testament builds that out. Everything I just kind of summarized is like a rough summary of much of New Testament theology on the resurrection. That being said, God's point of view, though, is born out of, if he is as he says we are, which I believe, I could defend logically with logical, a lot of logical coherence, and I could defend that, and I could say, well, he's omnipotent, he's omniscient, omnipresent, so he's omnipresent, all-knowing, he's everywhere, and he has the property of immensity, which means he can attend to all data points at all times, in all places, with the equal amount of attention without any diminishment, which is wild, totally wild. With that being said, it wouldn't be that God's point of view is biased. It would be quite the opposite. It would be that God's point of view is built out of every singular data point at all times and all places that has, and it would be all, I guess, analyzed, comprehended, and understood. And then the point of view that God would provide would be his very distinct point of view, very profound bent on the event, the resurrection, but it wouldn't be born out of limitation. It would be born out of maximally great data access, right? There's not even, when you think about data access, you might think about a big super. Don't even think about it like that, because supercomputers, right? What they do is they have all these different chips to be able to have this massive computational power, but they're still sequencing those computations, and there's still attentiveness in the processes, right? So throw all that out the window. So forget all of that. So you have omniscience. If you're omnipotent, and you're all-knowing, and you're everywhere, so you have access to everything, and you're immense, so you have no diminution or any need for sequence or processing power. If all of that's true, then you know all this stuff almost like a singular point. It's kind of wild, actually. Sometimes there's almost an analogy here with this notion of the Big Bang, right? You've got, like, in the initial little explosion, somehow the summary of all things in the universe as it currently is, but somehow that was summarized down into a point. So in the way that God would understand things would be something very similar to that, that his point of view, though, is born out of a maximally great data set, a data set that can't be overcome, a data set that he himself and only he will ever have access to. And the scripture would be the delivering of the point of view of his that isn't biased, and that we typically call the objective truth. So if you're a religious person, somebody who believes in revealed religion, that is, God spoke, right? He said something, there's revelation. And it is, since it comes from the author of all truth, right? He who is definitional truth. He that is the metaphysical backdrop for truth as we know it in our creaturely realm. He who is the precondition for the notion of truth. So, God is much more than just the truth in that sense. He's actually he who gives truth definitional value. And we could, again, I have to do a whole nother theological philosophy on this to really unpack this. But all humans are biased because their point of view are born out of limitation. God's point of view is born out of maximally great amount of data. And as such, his view would be the most objective on the matter, because it would be the one born out of the maximally great amount of data. So if you accept the traditional maximally great God, as Scripture presents him, if you accept that he is, then it follows that God's point of view isn't biased. It's profoundly distinct and profoundly has incredible leaning in what would appear to us as bias. But it wouldn't be biased, because if he is as he says he is, and as religious people believe he is, then his knowledge is maximally great, and his attention is maximally perfect. And as such, it would be that his interpretation of the event of the resurrection has the most data supporting it, and a mind that can attend to all that data at equal amount of excellence, without any diminishment or any need for error due to processing or sequence. Now, again, totally wild stuff, right? Like, I mean, you can't, me even articulating this pushes my human mind to think through what I'm saying as I'm saying it. And it can sound a bit over the top, and that's kind of the point of God. The point of God is that he is, to speak like a gamer, OP in the extreme. Putting God into a video game has always been uninteresting, because there's no way to even visually represent him. The type of OP-ness you would have of the creator of all things is something that the best you can do is create some sort of mythological outside the universe being that can't even be visually represented necessarily. If you want to see a visual representation, you would go look at Jesus Christ and his life, and that would tell you as much as you can know about God visually with the human mind. So is God, to answer the question, June 24th, 2022, is God biased? The answer is no. Does God have a point of view? The answer is yes. Are humans biased? The answer is yes. Do humans have a point of view? Yes. Okay. God's point of view is born out of a maximally great, incredible set of data points in this maximally great sort of way. Humanity's point of view is built from their limitations and their attempt to overcome those limitations. As such, although I've said even God has a point of view in the past, I am not conceding the notion that God is biased, because that would be almost an act of idolatry, because I'd be making him like a creature. And I don't. I have zero interest in trying to define or defend God in kind of this submitting to other worldviews sort of way, right? So I'm going to take my worldview, I'm going to max that out. I'm going to say, this is what my worldview is, and I think it's awesome because of X, Y, Z. And I think your worldview kind of sucks because it looks like X, Y, or ABC. And it doesn't do nearly as much, doesn't provide as much interest. The narratives it tells, the mythologies that could be entailed in it, aren't nearly as interesting as my narrative, as my meta narrative. And so you're going to kind of compare those things. The reason why I'm telling you that at the end here is because I am taking a maximally great view of God based on what I would call either explicit or implicit statements from Scripture on him. And someone might say, well, because I've had enough of these conversations. Well, infinity is actually a negative attribute, right? So you're saying, well, God is infinite, and he doesn't have limitations, blah blah blah. That's actually a negative attribute that nobody's ever experienced, and I'm going to admit all of that. So saying that the extrapolation from the finite to the infinite, I can have a inkling of what that's like. So, for instance, extrapolating the notion of eternality, right? That would be to be infinitely existing through time. I can imagine that through just extending the notion of my current life for an indefinite amount of time. Now, it doesn't mean I understand what it means to be infinite. I don't. The point is, though, is that I don't have, it's not that I don't have any understanding, though, of what it means to be eternal. I can have an inkling of that. And from that, I can build. This is the great thing about human life, imagination, the mystery of human consciousness, is that we can break our boundaries with imagination. We can transcend the limitations of our current situation, and we can break through and create stories and all sorts of imaginative narratives. It's something profoundly unique about humanity, and it's worthy of questioning. If you've ever listened, I listened to Jordan Peterson, and I think it was Jensen that he was having a conversation with. Even somebody that's a theoretical physicist is asking profound questions about the nature of human consciousness in terms of logical processing, meaning that there seems to be preconditions for algorithmic processing, even if the human mind can be thought of as some sort of algorithm in the way that it processes data. He's going to say there's still pre-understanding to that process. There's valuation. And I would say, in my interpretation, I would say, this astrophysicist is likewise saying, he's there at Oxford, he's likewise saying that there's a degree of trust and the valuations, or how you adjudicate what is a desirable goal, before you move into the algorithmic, computational, human mind process of how to achieve that goal. And so he calls it a understanding. And of course, the question is, where does that understanding come from? And that is a question that theoretical astrophysicist there has been thinking. He's about, I think he's getting close to 90, but he's been thinking about that almost his whole life. And obviously, he's one of the leading intellectuals in the world on this matter. Peterson's trying to work through his own wrestling of faith there. So it's pretty interesting. But to answer the question, and I think I've sufficiently answered it for myself, and I'm just inviting you into my process here as I think through some of these things. Answering difficult questions about God, and then blending out into some areas. I find Jordan Peterson's kind of renaissance man of jumping around between different categories. I find myself very much at home with that way of going about things. I know that I lose people. Even me listening to him, there's a certain amount of inquiry that I think is helpful, and academic rigor that I like. But the conviction I came down with when I finished my doctoral work was that, about 1.1% of the world really wants to listen to that. Everyone else isn't even going to begin to get into those conversations. So they have some measure of value. I just don't know how valuable that is. But I'm extremely interested in finance and economic theory. And I do have a profound interest in certain measures of quantum physics and chaos theory. And of course, they were discussing many of these things. So I'm tracking with it, and it's interesting. And so I think we should kind of go at some of these questions from a psychoanalytical sort of way. And this is my philosophical way of answering the question of, is God biased? And it is me profoundly using my worldview to answer the question. And the question is, no, he's not biased, but he does have a distinct point of view. The difference is that his would be built out of what is definitional to objective data or objective truth. So basically, the mind that can have access to all data at the same time in a maximally great sort of way, he would be the one that is most fitting to give a point of view on the data that would accord with what is attuned to objective reality. What is the actual nature of the universe, and what is its actual objective structure? Only a mind like God's with that type of capacity could even, he's the only one that could provide such a definition. And I'm not saying I know it. I'm simply saying, because of my belief in this maximally great being, that I think I have pretty good, reformed epistemological grounds to stand on. I don't believe that he's biased, but I believe he has a profound point of view. And as such, if you don't want to attune yourself to his point of view, you're disagreeing not just with, some people hand waving sort of way, this, ancient authors and patriarchic ancient world, and kind of just dismiss them, but you're actually not attuned to a maximally great being who has maximally greater access to all data at all times and all places without diminution of attention to back that up. And hence his framework of knowledge would be the objective standard. So it wouldn't even be that it is the objective truth as much as it is itself constitutive of the objective truth, which is a crazy thing to think. Okay, so I think I'm getting pretty nerdy here, so I'm going to stop there. If you have questions, ask them. I exist to answer difficult questions about God, and not just in traditional Judeo-Christian sorts of ways. I like to think of myself as much a philosopher as I am a theologian, and then I do branch out. Like I said, I've significant interest in mathematics, astrophysics, and obviously the philosophical side of it, and other economics, finance. I have a great measure of interest in some of these other items, and I'm continuing to grow. For an academician, I'm a relatively young guy, although I've kind of see myself as more like an esoteric artist than anything, but whatever. Behind me, you'll see that we got the United States flag, Pennsylvania flag, which I love. I think it's beautiful. It says virtue, independence, and liberty on it, which are all values I think we can get aboard. This is June 24th, 2022, the day Roe v. Wade ended. And is God biased? The answer is no. Does he have a profound point of view? The answer is yes. But he is not biased like humans. Biased are built from restrictions, and God has none. As such, God cannot be biased, although he can still have a profound point of view that I would say attune yourself to, because it's better than the alternatives. Thanks so much for listening. This is Dr. Scalise.